Push, Margaret, push. Just a little more.
Ah, it's a girl.
She was only 13 years old when they placed a crown on her head and sent her north to marry a king. Her name was Margaret Tudor, the eldest daughter of Henry VII, and the older sister of Henry VIII, a princess born into a dynasty that had clawed its way to the throne with blood and marriage, and intended to keep it with treaties and daughters. In the summer of the year 1503, Margaret rode across the English border in a cascade of silk, gold-threaded gowns, and whispered prayers, destined to become Queen of Scotland. But behind the fanfare and dancing pipers, behind the feasts and the carefully arranged banners of peace, the reality was far more brutal. What Margaret carried into Scotland was not just a royal dowry. She carried betrayal, war, death, and the seed of a united crown that would only bloom more than a century after she was gone. The streets of Edinburgh roared with joy. The day she arrived, wine was handed out by the barrel. Crowds pressed forward to glimpse the English princess who would wed their king, James IV, a monarch already famed for his charm, his court, his lovers, and his 7 illegitimate children, now in his early 30s. James had no legitimate heir and had set his sights on Margaret as both a wife and a political pawn. He saw her as a means to secure peace with England, to elevate Scotland's prestige, and to cement his dynasty. But he did not see the child behind the title, the girl who had lost her mother only 3 months earlier, the daughter who knew she might never see her father again, and who had been trained since infancy not to cry in public, not to speak out of turn, and not to expect to be loved. Her first letters from Scotland were aching with homesickness. She called her father Your Grace, begged God for comfort, and ended her letter with the quiet, desperate line, I wish I were with you now, and many times more. But her father Henry VII had no intention of replying. He did not send his daughter to Scotland to be comforted. He sent her to be paraded. Margaret was dressed and redressed multiple times a day, shown off like a living jewel to Scottish nobles, and made to perform the role of political bride to perfection. She was slim, red-haired, and graceful, and as she entered each town along her journey, she did so in regal silence, cloaked in foreign silk and the weight of a crown that was never meant to be hers. The king met her at Dalkeith Castle, and he had prepared every detail for maximum effect. James IV was not cruel. He was charming, theatrical, and knew how to dazzle. He rode beside Margaret into Edinburgh, wrapping his arm around her waist like a knight from a romance tale, smiling broadly for the crowds who cheered for a future they would never see. The wedding at Holyrood Abbey was one of the most extravagant Scotland had ever known. A full quarter of the royal income for that year was spent on wine alone. Margaret and James wore matching outfits, posed for portraits, and exchanged vows under candlelight. But even as they kissed for the crowd, one woman remained hidden from view, Janet Kennedy, the king's mistress, pregnant with her 3rd child by James. She had not been dismissed. She had simply been moved out of sight. Margaret quickly realized that the marriage was not what it seemed. Her husband, while attentive in public, spent more time discussing military matters with his nobles than with her. In private, he was kind but distant, and though she would eventually give birth to children, many of them died in infancy. Only one son, James V, born in the year 1512, survived. Still, Margaret played her role as queen with determination. She hosted balls, danced in silken gowns, presided over a court that glimmered with poetry, music, and ceremony. She smiled for the foreign envoys. She wrote letters home. She continued to hope, but inside, she was beginning to understand that her value in this world was measured in treaties and bloodlines, not affection. Her younger brother, Henry VIII. I had no intention of making her life easier. When their father died, Margaret should have inherited lands, jewelry, and money, a generous legacy meant to support her. But Henry withheld it. Out of spite, out of pride, out of a petty bitterness that his sister had once outranked him in ceremony. Margaret was furious. She wrote to him, scolding his behavior, declaring that their father's legacy was not worth such estimation if it came with shame. She stood up for herself, even as she remained a stranger in a foreign court, raising a son with a husband who refused to be faithful. And then came the collapse. In the year 1513, Henry VIII declared war on France. The French king called on Scotland to honor its ancient alliance. James IV, Margaret's husband, answered the call. Against his wife's warnings, against the tides of caution, he raised an army and marched south into England. At the Battle of Flodden, on a cold September hillside, soaked with rain and blood, 10,000 Scots were killed. Among them, the king himself, James IV, husband of Margaret, father of her child. The body of the monarch was lost in the carnage. And Margaret, at the age of 23, became a widow, alone, vulnerable, and the mother of a 1-year-old heir to the throne. That was when she made a decision that would haunt the rest of her life. She did not weep. She did not retreat. She took her infant son to Stirling Castle and had him crowned King James V of Scotland. She assumed the regency. She claimed power. She declared herself not just the mother of the king, but the guardian of the realm. But the will of her late husband had left a cruel condition. She would only remain regent if she did not remarry. In a land of war-hardened men, suspicious nobles, and foreign enemies circling like vultures, Margaret Tudor, a foreign-born queen with no army of her own, now had to rule alone. And what she chose next would shape not only her own fate, but the future of the British Isles for generations to come. But this is only the beginning. It began, not with a kiss, but with a saddle. The people who saw it never forgot. A young English princess. Her hair, the color of fire under a low Scottish sky. Perched stiffly on a horse beside her husband, a man twice her age. Already seasoned by women and war. The wind whispered through the hills as James, King of Scots, wrapped his arm around her waist and guided her down through the gates of Edinburgh. Into the noise and the cheering and the wine-soaked streets that reeked of smoke and celebration. It was a royal procession. Yes, but also something stranger. Something closer to theater. And she was not the actress. She was the prop. Margaret Tudor had ridden all the way from the English court with dreams sewn into her sleeves. She had been trained for this moment. Sculpted into silence. Painted into obedience. Since birth, she had been told she was England's daughter and would marry for peace. But no one had told her what it would feel like to sleep in a stone room in a strange country, where the air was colder, the accent thicker, and the man who now called her wife already had a mistress who refused to leave. The marriage was loud. The wedding night was quiet. There are no surviving letters that describe it, only the image of the couple in matching outfits, standing before the altar at Holyrood Abbey. The smell of candle wax thick in the air. Margaret's young hands trembling inside, gloves laced with gold thread. 1/4 of the king's annual income was spent on wine for the occasion. Banners flew. Poets recited verses. And the girl who barely understood the dialect of her new subjects nodded, smiled, bowed, curtsied, kissed the ring, and followed the script. But when the guests faded and the feasting ended and the music fell silent, the doors closed, and what passed between them, husband and bride, remains hidden. Perhaps James tried to be gentle. He was not known to be cruel, but he was known to be practiced, and Margaret was known to be alone. Still, the world outside expected joy. And so, she wrote. The first letter home came in August of that year, written with an anxious, almost disparate hand, addressed to her father, King Henry VII. Now, a grieving widower, she poured out a child's longing in a queen's voice. God send me comfort, she whispered to the page, that I and mine that be left here with me be well entreated. The word entreated was a Tudor's polite way of begging not to be forgotten. She asked to be remembered. She asked to be cared for. She asked, over and over again, for a response. But no response came. Henry VII never replied. And why would he? His daughter had done her duty. She had crossed the border, worn the crown, and sealed the treaty. Her value had been extracted, like a vein of gold pulled from the hills, and there was no need to polish it further. Back in England, her younger brother Henry was growing taller, louder, increasingly convinced that the world owed him something grand. But in Scotland, Margaret was still a child, learning how to be royal without a mirror. She looked at herself not through her own eyes, but through the letters she wrote and the silences that answered back. Her mother was gone. Her father no longer answered. Her brother was not yet king. And her husband, well, her husband was often somewhere else. The King of Scotland, James IV, was a man of contradictions. He was interested in everything: astronomy, dentistry, shipbuilding, poetry. He spoke Latin and French, and the language of seduction. He loved music, and wine, and war. And though he treated Margaret with a certain polished courtesy, he did not treat her with intimacy. She became, very quickly, another part of his collection, a crown to polish, a jewel to display, but not a voice to hear. He had already fathered at least 7 children by other women before Margaret arrived. One of them, Janet Kennedy, was pregnant with her 3rd when Margaret married him, but no one whispered this to the English girl in silk. No one dared. They smiled, bowed, and called her queen. And she did what Tudor women had always been taught to do. She obeyed. Still, she did try. She tried to be graceful. She tried to please. She threw herself into her new role with quiet desperation, learning to nod in all the right places, dance when asked, and flatter the nobles whose loyalty she would one day need. She learned how to wear her gowns with a dignity that outshone her years. And when her husband took her to public events, she smiled as if none of it hurt. But it did. In the letters that followed, we see glimpses, tiny fractures in the mask. She wrote to her family about gowns, jewels, feasts, the things she was supposed to enjoy, but her words were always wrapped in questions. Do they remember me? Will they write back? Am I doing this right? She confessed homesickness. She confessed confusion. She confessed, in careful phrases, that though the court was beautiful, it did not feel like hers. And then came the whispers about inheritance, about money, about betrayal. Her father, before his death, had promised her gifts, possessions, lands, legacies befitting a princess of England. But when the will was read and the goods divided, Margaret received nothing. Her brother, now King Henry VIII, withheld it. whether out of cruelty, neglect, or arrogance. We cannot say. But she knew it. She felt it. And she wrote to him with barely veiled fury. "We cannot believe," she wrote, "that out of your mind or by your command we are so unkindly dealt with." Her pain seeped through every sentence. Her trust in her family broken. Slowly, deliberately, across distance and silence. Yet in public, she smiled. She wore the gowns. She played the part. She presided over a court that grew more refined with each passing season. Music and poetry flourished. Dancers twirled under vaulted ceilings. Margaret began to move with the rhythm of the country that had adopted her. She began to believe, perhaps, that she could become more than a political instrument, that she might one day rule in her own right. Not as a foreign wife, but as a sovereign mother. When she became pregnant for the first time, she must have felt a flicker of hope, but the child did not survive. Nor did the next, or the next. The throne was fragile. And so were the babies meant to sit upon it. Each tiny grave carved a deeper wound into her heart. But she did not crumble. When James V was born in the year 1512, she held him like an anchor, her proof that her presence in this cold foreign land had meaning. But James, her husband, was slipping away into maps and navies and the chessboard of European politics, and Margaret, though crowned and cloaked and constantly watched, remained what she had always been, a young girl in a castle not her own. Writing letters no one would answer. Whispering questions into a silence that never broke. She did not know what was coming next. She did not know that war would rise again. That her brother's ambitions would pull two kingdoms into fire. That her husband would march into England and never return. That her son, the boy she clung to, would be crowned a king before he could speak in full sentences. She did not know that she would be left to rule alone. She only knew this. She had done everything she was told. She had smiled. She had served. She had waited. And no one, not a father, not a brother, not even a husband had come to answer her call. Not yet. They told her to wear gold. The dress was stitched with pearls, and the sleeves were heavy with embroidery. Margaret Tudor stood on the battlements of Stirling Castle, with her hand pressed lightly against her abdomen. The faint swell of yet another pregnancy, hidden beneath layers of fabric and royal ceremony. She was 23 years old. A queen, a widow, and a pawn. Once again, in a game she could never seem to escape. But this time, the game was war. And the silence that had greeted her letters for years was about to shatter in the sound of hooves, iron, and gunpowder. The year was 1513. Across the border, her younger brother, Henry VIII, had declared war on France, chasing glory, gold, and a reputation that still lived in the shadow of their father. France, in turn, called on its old ally Scotland for aid. And Scotland, led by Margaret's husband, King James IV, answered. Margaret's pleas were quiet, private, written in the kind of words only a wife can send to a man preparing to die. She had warned him, not because she feared for England, or even for her brother, but because she knew the man she married. James was clever. Yes, but untested. Ambitious. Yes, but reckless. She had seen the way he played politics like a game of chess. All pomp and pretense, but never grasping how blood stuck to the floor long after the banners had come down. Still, the decision had been made. Her husband raised his army, swore oaths, and rode out beneath a sky as gray and heavy as a dying vow. She watched him go from the same tower where she had once rocked an infant that did not live to see winter. But this time, she was not just sending away a man. She was sending away the last illusion that she had ever been safe. And somewhere beneath her gown, sewn discreetly along the inside hem, was a blade. She never said why. She never mentioned it in her letters. But she had it made. A small dagger, thin enough to hide, sharp enough to draw blood. Not for others, not for war, but for herself in case it came to that. In case Stirling Castle fell. In case she was taken. In case no one came. Meanwhile, James crossed into England with banners flying and drums beating. His army was vast. His cannons new. But his understanding of terrain, supply lines, and English weather was limited. On a remote, sloping field in Northumberland called Flodden, the Scottish army met the English forces smaller in number. But led by seasoned commanders, the earth was soaked with autumn rain. The Scottish cannons bogged down in marsh. The formations crumbled. And then came the slaughter. 10,000 Scots died that day. Among them, James. They say his body was so mutilated it could barely be recognized. That the banner he died beneath was trampled into mud. That his death left no final words. No whispered regrets. No poetic goodbyes. Just silence. Just blood. Just the sound of history turning its page without warning. Back at Stirling, Margaret was handed the news with a bow. Widowhood came to her, not in mourning cloth, but in command. Within days, she gathered what composure she had left, and rode with her infant son, James V, to the great hall of the castle. There, in front of assembled lords and bishops, the child was crowned, King of Scots. He was barely a year old. The crown sat awkwardly on his tiny head, and Margaret, behind him, held his hand and did not weep. She had lost a husband. She had gained a kingdom. But it came with conditions. In James's will, drawn up in anticipation of death, he had named her regent, but only so long as she remained a widow. Scotland would not tolerate a foreign queen with a foreign tongue ruling over native-born men while holding another man's hand. They would allow her to rule, but only alone. The message was clear. Her power would be tolerated, but not trusted. Her position would be legal, but not safe. Her throne would be temporary, conditional, fragile. Still, she took it. Margaret, for the first time, wielded real power. And for a moment, a breath, a heartbeat in the life of a woman who had known nothing but obedience, she ruled. She held council. She signed proclamations. She defended the rights of her son and the memory of her husband. She believed, perhaps foolishly, that she could hold the center. But the wolves were already circling. In the north, whispers began. Nobles muttered about her blood. English, not Scottish. They resented her presence, her accent, her orders. They questioned her loyalty, accused her of writing too often to her brother Henry. I feared she might hand the boy king over to English influence. They wanted someone else, someone stronger, someone male. Margaret was pregnant again, and she was alone. And then, in August of the year 1514, she made the most dangerous decision of her life. She married again. His name was Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus Handsome, powerful, and from one of the most divisive families in all of Scotland. He offered strength and protection, and a name that meant something to the nobles who still saw Margaret as a Tudor outsider. But what he took in return was everything. The regency was stripped from her the moment the vows were said. The lords declared her unfit. Her children, James and his younger brother, were taken from her care. The castles she lived in were seized. Her letters were ignored. And her new husband began his slow betrayal. When Margaret realized what had happened, it was too late. The boy king was under the guardianship of John Stuart, Duke of Albany, a distant cousin born and raised in France, who had returned to Scotland like a shadow, quiet and calculating. He was regent now, and he wanted her gone. Margaret's final act as queen in power was not political. It was maternal. She wrote one last letter to her brother. My partly adversary continues in their malice. They proceed in Parliament, usurping the king's authority. All the welfare of me and my children rest in your hands. No answer came. Her brother had always been better at war than rescue. So she packed what little she could pregnant again, humiliated again, and fled south toward the English border. Her newborn in her arms, her titles behind her. She had no castle, no army, no crown, just a sword beneath her petticoat and a heart full of thunder. The child she carried would be her last, and the kingdom she left behind, it would never forget her, but it would never thank her either. He was handsome when she married him, handsome in that dangerous way. Certain men are broad-shouldered, noble-born, and quick with words, but quicker with silence when it suited him. Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus, had offered Margaret Tudor safety when the ground beneath her was splitting open. Her husband was dead. Her children were under threat. Her regency, already crumbling, had been tied to a vow of widowhood she could no longer bear. And so, in the soft haze of grief and longing, she took his hand and thought it might lead her back to power. It did not. Within weeks of their wedding in the late summer of 1514, everything Margaret had fought to hold collapsed around her like a burning chapel. The Scottish lords, already whispering about her foreign blood, now had cause to strike. By marrying again, she had broken the will of James IV. They stripped her of the regency. The crown was no longer hers to guard. Her children were no longer hers to protect. The Duke of Albany, a man she had never met, sailed in from France with titles and men and money and charm. The Parliament opened its arms to him. And Margaret, Queen Dowager of Scotland, once the bright hope of peace between two kingdoms, became an obstacle in her own story. She was pregnant again. By winter, she had lost her sons, not to death, not yet, but to power. Albany had taken custody of them under the pretense of protection. Margaret, furious and increasingly isolated, wrote to Henry, her brother, the King of England. He removed and put me from my said castle. She penned, and by his crafty and subtle ways made me renounce my office of tutrix and governess. The words spilled with bitterness. Her ink was soaked in betrayal. She did not know it yet. But this would be her last real grip on the Scottish throne. And Angus, the man she had married for strength, vanished like smoke in the wind. He was not cruel, not yet. But he was absent, more interested in court games and private advancement than in the crying of newborns or the weeping of queens. When Albany moved to seize control of Stirling Castle, Margaret, heavily pregnant, terrified, still bleeding from the cuts of so many sudden losses, made the only choice left to her. She fled, southward, across the border, into England. It was a ride of desperation, not ceremony. No banners, no guards, no procession of jewels and trumpets like the one that had greeted her a decade earlier. Just a broken woman on horseback, wrapped in furs, her belly swollen with a child she hadn't wanted to deliver in exile. At Harbottle Castle, in the cold stone chambers near the English border, she gave birth to her last child, a daughter. The girl was named Margaret, after her mother. But the moment was not joyful. It was not soft. It was survival. The castle was damp. The food scarce. The wind howled through the arrow slits, like a voice come to judge. And when she wrote to Albany to inform him of the birth, her words were brittle with restraint by the grace of Almighty God. I am delivered and have a Christian soul. Being a young lady, it was not a declaration. It was a warning. But Albany had already taken what he wanted, and Angus, sensing the political weather turn, fled not toward her, but toward France. Then, back to England, where he placed their daughter, Lady Margaret Douglas, at the English court. Far from the mother who bore her, it would be years before they would meet again. And even then, daughter and mother would never truly know one another. Margaret, too, returned to England, briefly seeking the comfort of the only two people who might still call her family, her sister Mary, who had shocked all of Europe by marrying for love, and her brother Henry, who ruled with fists and appetites and a crown grown too heavy for any one man's conscience. Henry received her kindly. He gave her rooms, gifts, smiles, but no promises. He made it clear her place was not in England. It was in Scotland, where her son would one day rule. Her grief was hers to carry, her mistakes, hers to bury. So she went back. She returned, not as queen, not even as regent, but as a mother, and mothers, when they are stripped of everything else, remember how to wait. Albany left again for France in the year 1524. The court reshuffled. Alliances cracked and reformed. And Margaret, for the third time in her life, stepped back into the circle of power. Her son, James V, now 12, was declared of age, a boy king, a fragile figurehead, but hers again. She did not intend to share him. And when Angus, the same husband who had vanished, who had abandoned her at Harbottle, who had stolen her child and sought favor in two countries, returned to Scotland, demanding influence, she answered him with fire. She ordered the cannons of Edinburgh Castle turned upon him. The sky cracked open with thunder. The windows shook. Margaret, now in her late 30s, stood in the ramparts like a woman who had finally remembered her own name. The Earl of Angus had returned with soldiers, with allies, with men in steel and leather. But she had the boy. She had the crown. And for one trembling moment in history, she had the upper hand. But Angus, always the better player, did not fight with cannons. He fought with counsels, with law, with charm. By the end of the year, 1525, he had slithered his way into the chambers of influence and seized control of young James. He took the boy, took the court, took the throne, not as king, but as custodian, the shadow behind the chair, the voice behind the crown. For 3 long years, he controlled the realm through the boy. And Margaret, mother of the king, was once again cut out of her own child's life. James hated him. The boy saw the trap, but he was still a child. He could not fight what his mother had invited into their lives through the soft gate of her loneliness. Margaret begged the Pope for a divorce, pleaded with Rome. She wrote letters to Henry, to bishops, to kings, to anyone who might undo the bond she had foolishly sealed in that second wedding years ago. And in the year 1527, her request was granted. Her marriage to Angus was annulled. The same year, her brother Henry would begin divorce proceedings of his own against Catherine of Aragon. But where Henry sought freedom for lust, Margaret sought it for survival. She had loved no one in years. Until Henry Stuart. He was younger. A member of her household. Not noble. Not powerful. But kind. And after all the fire and glass she had walked through, Margaret fell in love, again quietly. She was 39. Her hair no longer glinted in candlelight, as it once had. But her eyes still burned. James, her son, gave permission for the wedding. But it came with a warning: she was not to interfere with governance. Not to meddle. Not to reach again. And she agreed. Because she was tired. Because the husband she once hoped would lift her had instead hollowed her out from within. Exploded her reign. And stolen her son. And the son, now nearing adulthood, had taken it all back. But he had not returned it to her. The throne was his now. And she, Margaret Tudor, would never sit upon it again. By the time she married for the third time, there was no music left in her footsteps. The halls she once danced through as a new queen had turned cold, silent, and unfamiliar. And though her face still bore the angles of beauty, the high cheekbones of York blood, the poised Tudor jawline, time had softened her radiance into something quieter, something heavier. She had been queen, a regent, prisoner, fugitive, mother, widow, and now, once again, wife. But this time, Margaret Tudor knew better than to expect anything soft or safe from marriage. She did not marry Henry Stuart because of love. Not entirely. She married him because he was near, because he was kind, because he did not ask for power, because, in that thin slice of time after her annulment from Angus, she simply wanted something that belonged to her, even if just for a season. The year was 1528, and Scotland was no longer a land of poetry for her. Its hills no longer whispered the promises of home. Its nobles no longer pretended to respect her. She was tolerated, watched, sometimes smiled at, but never embraced. Her son, James V, now in his mid-teens, and sat on the throne she had once cradled him to reach. He was sharp, impatient, already cleverer than his advisors, and increasingly aware that the legacy of his mother was a storm he would always have to sail through. He permitted her marriage to Henry Stuart, but he extracted a price, one not written in laws, but in glances and distance, that she would not meddle, that she would not reach again for influence, that she would step back from the edge of power and let the new king breathe without the weight of his mother's shadow. Margaret agreed. But stepping back was not the same as vanishing. Henry Stuart, made Lord Methven shortly after their union, was neither cruel nor gentle. He was ambitious in the way ivy is ambitious, slowly climbing, twisting, wrapping itself around the stone, until the structure beneath forgets what it looked like before. He smiled. He obeyed. But he took. Quietly. He drained her household finances, made enemies at court, and like the two husbands before him, began to spend more nights elsewhere. Rumors reached her ears in fragments at first, like cold water dripping through the roof at midnight. Affairs, debts, disloyal whispers. She ignored them, then endured them, then accepted them. What she could not accept was being erased. Margaret had ruled Scotland, not once, but twice. She had defended its throne with her body, its lineage with her womb, and its future with her name. She had fled through snowstorms with a baby in her arms. She had bled in the borderlands of England, given birth alone in drafty castles, stood her ground while soldiers aimed cannons at her gate, and had watched men eat the future from her hands like wolves at a banquet. And now, in her 40s, she was expected to disappear quietly, to become ornamental, a relic of a war that had not yet ended, a woman whose time was over. But Margaret Tudor had never been a woman who disappeared quietly. She returned to court, not as queen, not as regent, but as something more complicated, a living reminder. Mary of Guise, the new queen, wife of James V, was a French noblewoman of grace and calculation. And to her credit, she did not push Margaret away. She understood the politics of presence. She allowed Margaret to hover near the throne, not to hold it, but to haunt it. And Margaret, in turn, gave her loyalty, or at least the appearance of it. The two women shared court dinners, exchanged soft glances, measured each other like chess players in the third hour of a match. But Margaret saw something in Mary that made her pause, not cruelty, but competence. Here was a woman who might actually endure, and Margaret, whose bones had begun to ache with every winter. I began to let go, but the kingdom would not. Scotland was splitting again. Factions formed like cracks in ice, some loyal to James, some to the Douglases, some still whispering about Albany, others pulling strings from France or England or the cathedrals that loomed behind every political decision. Religion was beginning to stir in a new and violent way. Whispers of reform, of Rome's corruption, of heresy and fire and cleansing. It was all beginning to swirl just beneath the surface. Margaret had seen enough of history to know when it was about to change its clothes and declare itself new. She watched carefully, but her power was limited now. Her name no longer opened doors. Her son ruled without her. Until the boys died. They were not hers. They were her grandsons, the children of James and Mary of Guise, and they died within days of each other in the year 1541. No fever. No explanation. Just death. 2 royal coffins. 2 little crowns. And Margaret, the old queen, watching another line end before it had ever begun. Something inside her settled then. Not with peace, but with stillness. She remained at Methven Castle, her body slowing, her voice keyeder. She wrote fewer letters, attended fewer feasts. The court no longer needed her stories. The world no longer asked for her. And for the first time in her life, Margaret Tudor had nothing left to fight. She had lost her father, her mother, her brothers, her husbands, her children. She had lost England. She had lost Scotland. But she had not lost herself. That came later. In October of that same year, Margaret suffered a stroke. It came without warning. Without drama, no battle. No betrayal. No fire. No fall. Just stillness. She lay in the castle outside Perth, half paralyzed, half aware, and waited. She sent for her son, James, but he did not reach her in time. She died before his arrival. Alone. She was buried at the Carthusian Abbey of St. John in Perth, among kings and queens who had known far less pain and far more luxury. But the abbey was desecrated during the Reformation. Her tomb, like her life, was shattered. Her bones burned. Her name scraped from stone. She has no monument, no statue, no memorial song. And yet, her blood flows through every monarch who sat upon the English throne after Elizabeth. Her line merged the crowns. Her son gave birth to a dynasty. Her suffering stitched the flags together. They called it union. But for her, It was just survival. And the marriage that broke the kingdom, the one that cost her the throne, her children, and her peace was not the one she regrets. It was the one she never escaped. There is a moment in every life quiet, nearly invisible, when everything could have gone differently. Not because of destiny, not because of fate, but because of a single breath, held just a moment too long, or released just a moment too soon. For Margaret Tudor, that moment came not in a throne room or at an altar, but on a narrow, wind-bitten road near the English border. Long before the soldiers came, before the cannons were loaded, before the treaties were torn apart again, it came in silence. It came on horseback, and it came at a time when no one, not even she, knew whether the woman leaving Scotland was still a queen, or just a mother fleeing before the last wall fell. But to understand that moment, we must go back to the years after Flodden, after Albany, after Methven, back to when Margaret had clawed her way back into court with the stubborn dignity of someone who had lost everything twice and still refused to disappear. She had no power, not the kind that could be counted in lords or armies. But she had something else: memory. She remembered every promise broken, every child taken, every letter unanswered. And memory, in the right hands, can be sharper than a sword. She watched the court shift like a restless sea. Her son James, now a man, had grown into the role of king with a fury that startled even those who had known him as a boy. He was impatient. He was brilliant. And he was determined never to be controlled, not by England, not by Rome, and especially not by his mother. He respected Margaret, but he did not trust her. Not fully. And so she stayed at the edges, close enough to see, never close enough to touch. Scotland, meanwhile, was cracking. The weight of alliances pressed against its ribs like iron hands. France demanded loyalty. England demanded obedience. The church demanded faith. And the people demanded bread and peace, and a king who would not sell their future to the highest bidder. Reformation had not yet arrived, but it had begun to whisper. And Margaret, who had once worn her Catholicism like armor, now wore it like a memory of another time. And then came the news. The Earl of Lennox, one of the last nobles with royal blood close enough to challenge James, had raised an army. Not a rebellion. Not exactly. But a question. A hesitation. A pause in the current way. 6,000 men. Marching. Not toward the king, but toward something else. Toward justice. Toward revenge. Toward change. And at the center of it, unconfirmed, unspoken, but impossible to ignore, was the name of Margaret Tudor. It was never proven that she supported it, but James believed she did. The mother who had protected him in infancy, who had crowned him, who had sent letters begging popes and kings to save his throne, he now saw her as a threat. Not because she raised armies, but because she had done so before, and because she had survived so much already. It seemed impossible that she would simply stop. He ordered her watched, her movements recorded, her household restricted, and Margaret old enough now to feel death in the ache of her bones, but not old enough to accept erasure, made her decision. She escaped. She slipped away from the court, not like a criminal, but like a queen who had once been chased across the snows of the border with a newborn in her arms. This time, there was no child. There was only memory and defiance, and the knowledge that staying meant losing the last sliver of freedom she still possessed. She rode through the mist before dawn, her name unspoken, her titles forgotten. She rode as Margaret, not the Queen Dowager of Scotland, not the daughter of Henry VII, not the sister of Henry VIII. Just Margaret. Some say she intended to reach England. Some say she hoped to find safety with allies of the Douglas faction. Some say she meant to disappear entirely, to live her final years, not in stone palaces, but in quiet corners of the world where no one asked her for allegiance or forgiveness. No one knows, because the escape was incomplete. She was caught, not by soldiers, but by time. Margaret's flight ended in negotiation, a quiet agreement, reached behind the walls of a castle, where no witnesses recorded the words spoken. She was allowed to return, not in triumph, but in containment. James did not imprison her, but he did something colder. He erased her voice from court. He silenced her without chains, and when she returned, she found her household diminished, her husband more distant than ever, and her name once again brushed aside like an old song. No one sang anymore. But the 6,000 had marched. They had not reached the castle gates. They had not won. But they had moved. And in doing so, they reminded the kingdom and the king that Margaret's shadow was not so easily banished. There was an hour that changed everything. An hour when the gates could have opened, when the boy she had raised could have turned toward his mother, not with suspicion, but with memory, could have recalled her arms shielding him as a baby, her voice reading to him in Latin, her body between him and the wolves when he was too young to stand alone. But that hour passed. James ruled alone, and Margaret, for the first time in her life, it stopped fighting, not because she was defeated, but because she was tired. She walked slower, wrote less, sat longer by the windows. Her third husband, Methven, wandered further from her, more preoccupied with titles than touch. The Queen, Mary of Guise, offered small kindnesses, but they were not enough to fill the silence. Margaret's body had begun to fail. Her hands shook when writing. Her knees ached when she knelt. The memories came faster than the moments. And when the army of 6,000 dissolved into nothing, into rumors, into arrests, into silence, she did not mention it again. She simply watched the kingdom she had once tried to hold between her teeth move without her. Watched the son who had once cried in her arms deliver orders that excluded her name. Watched the wind change direction, and knew that she would not live to see where it blew next. She had escaped many things: husbands, kings, wars, but she could not escape time. Not even she could do that. There are some castles that don't need ghosts, because the stones themselves remember the footsteps, the secrets, the way the walls held their breath when names were spoken in the dark. Linlithgow, Stirling, Holyrood, Methven. Margaret Tudor had walked the corridors of them all, long after midnight, long after the courtiers had gone home, long after the children had fallen asleep, and the fire had burned down to whispers. She knew how sound carried through stone. She knew where the servants listened, and most of all, she knew what silence meant when it lasted just 1 second too long. Someone was watching, and someone was waiting. By the time she reached her final years, Margaret had become more symbol than person. Her body had softened with age. Her hands, once steady on the reins of Scotland's fate, now trembled when lifting a cup. Her face had lost the royal sheen that once glimmered beneath candlelight, but her mind had not dimmed. If anything, it had sharpened. Memory had hardened inside her like bone. She had watched too many men betray her, too many husbands lie, too many courtiers smile with blades hidden behind their backs. She had been queen, regent, widow, prisoner, mother, survivor, and now, in her late 40s, She was something even more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to prove. The court no longer feared her. But they should have. The year was nearing its end. The court had shifted again. James V, her son, now ruled with full authority. And the shadow of his mother, though long no longer touched his throne, his wife, Mary of Guise, had secured her place. The French alliance was strong, the English one fractured. Margaret was no longer welcome in decisions, no longer summoned to councils, no longer given the respect owed to a woman who had once carried the crown through fire. But she still lived in the castle, still had servants, still had eyes, and what she saw in the corridors of Methven and heard in the echo of quiet halls led her to one final act of defiance. A plot, not treason, not quite, but close. It began, as these things always do, with whispers, letters, unsigned, visits from gentlemen without official titles, conversations that paused when doors creaked open, a servant who returned from England with information no one had asked for, a noblewoman who met with a clerk of the English court and returned with nothing but a smile, too polite to mean nothing. Margaret began to stitch the pieces together, not because she wanted to reclaim power, but because something had shifted. Her third husband, Henry VIII, Lord Methven, had changed. He had always been unfaithful, always drawn to the scent of ambition like a dog to meat. But now, he had gone quiet, controlled, careful, as if he were no longer simply betraying her in the usual way but in a way that involved something larger. Margaret did not confront him. Not at first. She listened. She waited. And she began to gather her own net of watchers. Old friends. Former ladies-in-waiting. Men who still remembered her as the queen who had stood tall after Flodden. Quiet, loyal souls who did not seek titles or gold. Only justice. Together, they watched, and what they saw confirmed her fears. Letters being smuggled from Methven to England. Intercepted orders. Exchanges of money. Talk of lands and favors and unnamed arrangements that seemed to hover just on the edge of conspiracy. Margaret believed Methven was planning something, perhaps to undermine James, perhaps to broker something with the English court, perhaps to sell information about the Scottish king, the French queen, or the volatile situation between the crowns, perhaps even to betray Margaret herself a final time. Whatever it was enough. So she moved, quietly, carefully, but not without risk. She met in secret with her son. James had grown into a king who trusted no one, and certainly not his mother. Not fully. But he listened, and what she told him or showed him is not recorded in any letter. But it was enough to start the gears turning. Soon, Methven was summoned, questioned, searched. The crown confiscated his papers. Several servants disappeared. One of them was later found in a ditch outside Linlithgow. His throat slit too cleanly for it to be random. But Margaret's plan did not end the way she imagined. Methven was not exiled. He was not imprisoned. He was not executed. He was forgiven. Why? Because James had learned too well from his mother's mistakes. He did not want scandal. He did not want sympathy to turn toward his mother. So he smothered the fire before it could burn. He allowed Methven to return disgraced, but not destroyed. Stripped of titles, but not silenced. Margaret was told, gently and firmly, to step back. Again, the plot had almost worked. Almost. But almost means nothing in history. It did not restore her. It did not protect her. It did not stop the silence from returning. And so Margaret did what she had done before. She endured. She sat in her chambers and watched the snow fall. She walked the stone paths of the castle and listened to the wind. She stared at her hands, the same hands that had once crowned a baby in a storm, that had held 3 husbands, that had signed peace treaties and written desperate letters, that had, once, held a sword beneath a petticoat, and meant it. And she waited, for what no one knows. Perhaps for death, perhaps for redemption, perhaps just for the moment when anyone would say, "We remember," but that moment never came. She had seen too much death to be afraid of her own. It was not the blade she feared, not the silence before the drop, not the axe sharpened with ceremony, not the echo it left in the wood of the scaffold. Margaret Tudor had lived with death too long, too intimately, to flinch at the sound of it. She had held dead children in her arms, buried husbands, betrayed kings, laid flowers for boys who never got to rule. She had walked through rooms that still smelled like illness and sweat, her gown trailing through shadows that whispered of plague and treason. By the time the word execution began to stir once more in the cold air of court, Margaret no longer trembled. She watched, she listened, and she remembered. But this time, it wasn't her name on the list. It was her blood. Lady Margaret Douglas, her daughter by the man who had abandoned her in Harbottle, had grown into a girl as fierce and restless as her mother had once been. Clever-tongued, sharp-eyed, and flirtatious in the way girls are when they know they've been raised in courtrooms instead of nurseries. She had never really known her mother. Raised in England, brought up in Henry's court, she belonged more to her uncle than to the woman who had borne her alone in exile. But Margaret Tudor had always followed her child's path from afar. Letters, reports, fragments of gossip filtered through courtiers' mouths, and what she heard was enough to know that her daughter had inherited the fire but none of the fear, which made her dangerous. And in the court of Henry VIII, dangerous girls were never far from death. It began with a flirtation. A young man, a cousin of the king, someone whose blood, if tangled too tightly with hers, might create a future claimant to the throne, a future Henry did not approve. The name of the young man was Lord Thomas Howard. His blood, noble. His ambition, quiet. Their affection, secret. Or so they believed. But secrets are rarely kept in palaces. When the truth emerged that Lady Margaret Douglas and Lord Thomas Howard had intended to marry without the king's permission, it landed like a thunderclap across the English court. Henry was already unraveling. Catherine of Aragon had been cast aside. Anne Boleyn was still alive. But not for much longer. Henry's paranoia had grown teeth. And the idea that a young girl might plot her way into succession was enough to turn his wrath cold and surgical. Howard was imprisoned. Margaret Douglas was arrested. And from her quiet rooms in Scotland, the older Margaret, the mother who had once fled through snow with nothing but a name and a newborn, sat perfectly still. She did not cry. She did not scream. She wrote, "The letters do not survive, but their echoes do." Words sent across the border. Please. Perhaps. Or warnings. Or memories too sharp to be softened by distance. Margaret Tudor knew what the tower meant. She had watched too many heads fall in England to doubt the path her daughter had now been forced upon. But she also knew something else. Something even the king did not understand. She knew what it meant to survive a sentence, because Margaret herself had been sentenced before. Not by axe, not by rope, but by silence. She had been stripped of her children, her crowns, her place. She had been forced to sign her name beneath renunciations written by other men. She had been exiled. Irascid. reduced to nothing but breath and memory. And still she had remained. Now, she watched as her daughter faced the same narrowing corridor of power. Margaret Douglas, imprisoned, alone, accused of disloyalty, and Margaret Tudor, across the sea of hills and years, refused to fear the ending, because the ending had already come for her 1,000 times, because if death came again, it would not be with surprise. But it didn't come. Not for her daughter, Henry, perhaps moved by some fragment of family sentiment, or perhaps merely distracted by the impending fall of Anne Boleyn. Relented. Howard was not so lucky. He died in the Tower. But Margaret Douglas was spared. Released. Quietly. No apology. No explanation. The younger Margaret would go on. She would live. And the older Margaret, the mother who had been ready to mourn her child before the axe fell, returned once again to waiting. Waiting had become the language of her life. Waiting for letters. Waiting for peace. Waiting for forgiveness from sons who no longer remembered the softness of her hands. Waiting for a world that no longer spoke her name. Waiting. Perhaps most of all, for death to stop teasing her and come take its due. It would not be long now. Her body was failing slowly, with ceremony. Like the closing of a book, no one had finished reading. Her heart beat too heavily. Her joints ached even in sleep. Her hair had thinned. Her appetite faded. Her voice, once clear as a court bell, now cracked in the middle of sentences. The servants whispered at first that the Queen was nearing her end, that she had begun to speak to ghosts, that she had asked to see the letters from her father again, the ones he never answered. But Margaret was not broken. She still walked the halls when she could bay. She still looked out from the battlements, as if watching for someone to return. Not a husband, not even a child, but perhaps herself. The self she had been when she crossed the border at 13, when she had been promised peace, when she had believed that letters would always be answered, that crowns would always protect, that husbands would always love, that execution, whether by axe, by betrayal, or by history, would never come for her. But it always had, just not with blades. And when they finally found her, alone in her bedchamber in October of 1541, the sheets still warm, her hands folded as if in quiet prayer, they said her face was peaceful, not empty, not afraid, just still, as if she had seen it all coming, and had simply chosen not to flinch. Because Margaret Tudor had never feared execution. She had lived through too many kinds of death to be afraid of one more. There are queens who leave behind monuments, carved marble faces frozen in prayer, cathedral vaults that echo with choirs on anniversaries, crowns locked behind glass for schoolchildren to press their noses against and whisper about. And then there are queens like Margaret Tudor, who leave behind no statue, no epitaph, no resting place where flowers might be laid each year, but whose legacy breathes through centuries like a quiet, unrelenting wind. She was born into a family where love was measured in treaties and loyalty was a matter of survival. At 13, she was placed on a horse and sent across the border like a letter bearing peace, wrapped in silk and expectation. By 23, she was a widow. By 24, she had crowned a son. By 25, she had been stripped of power, betrayed by her own blood, forced to flee a castle that once belonged to her. Not once, but again and again. She married 3 times, loved, perhaps twice, trusted rarely. She raised a king, buried children, outlived husbands, recovered from exile, fought with cannons, held daggers, crossed the border, carrying nothing but a child and a name. She wrote letters no one answered. She begged for help that never came. She swallowed the silence and fed her children with its ashes. She learned, faster than most, that queenship was not a gown, it was armor. That motherhood was not a calling, it was war. And yet, she did not bend. Not truly. They tried to erase her. With words, with exile, with fire. In the end, even her bones were burned. The Reformation tore through Scotland like a cleansing fire. And Margaret's tomb, if it can even be called, that was desecrated along with the others. No stone remains. No monument marks where the woman who once held the Scottish crown in her arms now rests. The abbey she was buried in was gutted, stripped to walls and ruin. There is no place you can go and whisper her name into silence and expect an echo to return. But here is the truth. Margaret Tudor never needed stone to be remembered. She needed blood. And through her blood, history moved. Her son, James V. I would father Mary, the Queen of Scots. The doomed, defiant girl whose beauty would be turned into a battlefield. Her granddaughter, through Mary, would be the boy named James VI of Scotland, and the first of England, the king who united the crowns, the king who made her name matter again, not in gratitude, not in ceremony, but in fact. The name Tudor would end with her brother's children, but the legacy would pass through her body. The border she once crossed in terror would be erased by the grandson whose life came from her womb. That is not romance. That is not triumph. That is history. And it is enough. They say in her last days, she sat more often than she stood, her hands stiff from years of ink and cold, her voice worn thin from a lifetime of saying goodbye. But in her mind, she remembered it all. The ride into Edinburgh, the matching wedding gowns, the cannons fired against her second husband, the keys handed to Albany, the child she held when they told her the king was dead, the girl born in exile, the army that almost came, the letters they never answered, the windows where she stood, day after day, watching for someone to come. No one came, but she remained. And that, perhaps, is the greatest act of all. Margaret Tudor did not go out in fire. She did not fall to axe or betrayal. She did not beg for mercy, or vanish in the shadow of her son. She died, not on a battlefield, but on her own terms, quietly, with dignity, in a bed she chose, in a castle she once called home, and though she was lying down when they found her. And make no mistake, she died standing.